In this intense, emotional journey, watch as Lara makes a shocking mistake that threatens to tear everything apart. But as the truth comes crashing down, will her marriage survive the fallout, or will the distance become too much to overcome? Stay tuned to find out how this couple confronts their darkest secrets and whether love is enough to rebuild what was broken. Trust, betrayal, and the road to forgiveness. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Don't miss it. The kitchen was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of the clock ticking. Lara stood by the sink, washing the dishes. The soft hum of the dishwasher added to the silence. She wiped her hands dry, lost in thought. Her husband, Mark, sat at the dining table. His coffee sat untouched, cooling in the mug. It wasn't unusual, but something about his stillness today felt different. Lara could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. He looked at her, not in the usual way. His gaze was more intense. Something lingered in his eyes. She tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand. But then he spoke. "Lara, did you ever think about telling me?" Her heart skipped. Telling him what? She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her hand froze, gripping the dish towel. Mark was still watching her, his eyes never leaving her face. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "What do you mean?" she asked, the words sounding foreign in her mouth. Mark leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "About the phone call." Lara's chest tightened. The phone call? She hadn't thought about it since it happened. But now, hearing it from him, it all came rushing back. The conversation with an old friend, someone from years ago. She'd thought nothing of it. But now, her mind raced. "Phone call," she repeated, trying to sound casual. Mark's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. "I know you didn't mean for me to find out," he said, his voice low. Lara's pulse quickened. Her throat felt dry. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, but it sounded weak. She knew. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The words had slipped out just a little too casually. A slip-up. Something she hadn't meant to say. Something that had unraveled everything. Mark didn't speak for a long moment. He just stared at her, the silence deafening. Lara felt the walls of the kitchen closing in on her. Her heart raced in her chest. The weight of the truth was heavy, suffocating. She could hear her breath, shallow and uneven. Mark stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I just don't understand why you'd keep something like that from me." Lara's legs felt weak. She clutched the counter, steadying herself. The words were there, sitting on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. What could she say? What could she possibly say to make this right? Her mind raced, but her mouth remained frozen. Mark was still standing, his body tense. The air between them crackled with the weight of unsaid things. Her thoughts were a blur, like a flood she couldn't stop. She wanted to speak, to explain. But the truth? It seemed impossible to voice. She had always been careful. But now, the smallest slip, the tiniest crack, had shattered everything. The phone call. It was supposed to be nothing. A friend. A quick chat. Yet it had turned into this moment. This disaster. Lara's breath came in shallow bursts. She turned her back to Mark, trying to hide the panic rising inside her. Her fingers gripped the counter, knuckles white. She could hear the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. "I didn't think it mattered," she whispered. Mark took a step closer, his voice soft but heavy with disappointment. "But it does matter, Lara. It matters because you kept it from me." His words stung, each one a sharp reminder of what she'd done. What she'd failed to do. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She couldn't cry now. Not now. "I never meant to hurt you," she managed to say, though the words felt hollow. Mark let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Then why didn't you tell me?" Lara's mind screamed for escape, for a way out. But there was no way back now. Her slip-up had exposed everything. Her past, her secret, the things she'd buried deep inside. All of it laid bare in front of him. In front of her. "I didn't want to lose you," she said finally, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Mark stood motionless for a long time. Laura could feel the heat of his anger, even without him saying a word. The silence stretched so long it felt like it might break them both. Her pulse raced in her neck, each beat a painful reminder of the tension in the room. She couldn't breathe. Then, Mark's voice, quiet and controlled, cut through the air. "What did you think would happen, Laura? That I wouldn't find out?" Laura flinched, the sharpness of his tone sending a jolt through her body. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she whispered, her words barely audible. Mark sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what to think anymore." The weight of those words pressed down on her chest. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His face was a mixture of confusion and hurt. She saw it, plain as day. The trust was gone. Just like that. A slip of the tongue. And everything they had, everything she thought was solid, was unraveling before her eyes. The room felt suffocating, the silence louder than any words they could have spoken. Lara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She took a step toward him, but stopped herself, unsure. She wanted to reach out, to say something, anything that might fix this. But the truth was out. It hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and inescapable. Mark didn't move. His eyes, distant now, avoided hers. The man she knew, the one she had shared everything with, felt so far away. Laura felt the ground shift beneath her, her own footing uncertain. The life they built, the trust, all of it felt fragile now. How could one moment, one mistake, cause everything to crumble so quickly? She wanted to scream, to ask why this was happening, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she just stood there, frozen, the weight of her actions heavy on her shoulders. Mark's eyes flicked up to hers, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked again, softer this time. The question hung in the air like a shadow, following her wherever she went. Why didn't she tell him? How could she explain the hesitation, the fear of rejection? The truth, though it was ugly now. She had tried to protect him from it. But in doing so, she had hurt him far worse. "I didn't want to lose you," she repeated, the words tumbling out, raw and vulnerable. But Mark was no longer looking at her in the same way. He was distant, cold. His gaze shifted toward the window, where the faint glow of the streetlights seeped through the curtains. For a moment, it seemed like he was somewhere far away, lost in thought. Laura felt herself fading, her presence slipping from him. A few more moments passed, thick and painful, before Mark spoke again. "I don't know if I can get past this," he said quietly, almost to himself. Laura felt her chest tighten. Her throat burned. The tears were there now, but they wouldn't come. "I know I've messed up," she whispered. "But I never wanted to hurt you." His eyes met hers again, and this time there was something different, something colder. He nodded, slowly, as if weighing something inside of him. "I don't know what to do with this, Laura." She wanted to reach for him, to hold him, to make everything right. But the distance between them had grown so vast. She could feel it, feel how far apart they had become in such a short time. Her fingers trembled at her sides. All she wanted was for him to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple anymore. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of their silence. Lara's breath came in shallow bursts, the air thick with unspoken words. Mark still hadn't moved, still hadn't said anything more. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She could feel the rawness of the moment. It was impossible to ignore the distance growing between them, stretching further with every heartbeat. She opened her mouth, ready to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What more could she say? She had already said too much, and still it wasn't enough. His face was unreadable, a mask of emotions she couldn't decipher. For a moment, she wondered if it was all too late. Maybe she had already lost him. Maybe the truth had destroyed everything they'd worked for. I'm sorry, she finally managed, her voice a mere whisper. The apology felt empty, like it couldn't even begin to cover the damage. Mark's eyes flicked to her again, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there, lost in his thoughts. Lara's heart ached. She had wanted to be honest. She had wanted to come clean before the lie became something bigger than it was. But now, it felt like the truth was the one thing that had torn them apart. Is there anything I can do? She asked, her voice trembling. Mark's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as if words weren't enough. His frustration was palpable. I don't know, he said finally, his voice soft but heavy with resignation. Lara felt a pang in her chest. I wish I could fix this, she murmured, more to herself than to him. But she knew the truth now. There was no fixing it. Not anymore. The cracks were too deep. The trust had been shattered in a way that couldn't be mended overnight, if at all. Her thoughts were a mess, her mind swirling with regret and guilt. What could she do to make it right? How could she ever undo the damage? But the real question lingered, gnawing at her. Did he even want to try? She didn't have the answer. Mark turned away from her, his back now facing her. The distance between them grew even more, both physical and emotional. Lara's heart sank. She wanted to close the gap, but she didn't know how. And for the first time in their relationship, she wasn't sure if she even could. Everything felt fragile. Everything felt uncertain. The weight of the truth was still hanging between them. And it was clear now. There was no going back. The silence grew louder with each passing second, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Lara stood there, frozen in place, watching Mark's back. She longed for him to turn around, to look at her, to say something, anything. But he didn't. He stood still, his shoulders tense, his hands now resting by his sides. Lara's throat burned, but the tears still wouldn't come. Her eyes stung, the pressure in her chest unbearable. It was as if the space between them was becoming a chasm too wide to cross. She could feel the weight of everything she had done. Her mistake had been small, just a slip-up, a careless word. But in that moment, it had become something much bigger. Something unfixable. The thought that he might never trust her the same way again made her knees weaken. She wanted to go to him, to beg for his forgiveness, but the words were stuck in her throat. Would they even matter now? The truth had come out, and nothing would ever be the same. Mark shifted slightly, but he didn't turn around. I didn't think this would happen, Lara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's shoulders stiffened. I don't think any of us saw this coming, he muttered, his voice distant. Lara felt her heart drop. Each word felt like a stone, sinking deeper and deeper into the pit of her stomach. She opened her mouth again, trying to say something, anything to fix this, to bridge the gap, but the words wouldn't come. How could she fix something that was already broken? How could she heal the wound when the knife was still in her hand? Mark's voice cut through her thoughts. I need space, he said, the words sharp and final. Lara's chest tightened, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Space, she whispered, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. She had never imagined it would come to this. Never imagined he would ask for space. She had thought they were stronger than that. But now, she wasn't so sure. He took a step toward the door, but before he left, he spoke again, quieter this time. I need time to think, Lara. She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. He walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Lara stood there, rooted to the spot, the sound of his departure ringing in her ears. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Her heart felt as if it had stopped beating altogether. She sank to the floor, her legs too weak to hold her up. Tears finally came, then slow at first, then in waves. She had lost him. The truth had done its work, and now there was no going back. In that moment, Lara understood the full weight of what she had done. She couldn't undo the past, and whatever came next, it would never be the same. Lara sat there, crumpled on the floor, her tears falling like a slow, steady rain. Each drop felt like a memory slipping away, a piece of her life unraveling. The kitchen, once familiar and warm, now felt cold and alien. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, but even that seemed distant, muffled. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, trying to hold on to something. Anything. But there was nothing left to hold. Her mind was swirling with regret, replaying everything over and over again. The phone call, the slip-up, the lie. Why hadn't she been honest from the start? She could feel the weight of the lie pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her heart was broken, and the worst part was knowing she had broken it herself. She had let her fear, her desire to protect him, cloud her judgment. And now she was paying the price. The pain in her chest was unbearable. She wanted to reach out, to fix things, but she knew deep down it was too late. The trust between them had been shattered, and no amount of apologies or explanations would bring it back. The worst part was that she could feel him slipping away. Mark was no longer the man she had known. He was a stranger now, someone whose eyes no longer held the same warmth, the same love. She had seen it in his face, the coldness in his gaze, the way he had turned away from her. Her stomach twisted at the thought. How had it all gone so wrong? Lara stood slowly, her legs shaky beneath her, her body heavy with exhaustion. She walked to the window, staring out into the darkened street. The world outside seemed untouched, unaware of the storm that raged inside her. She wished she could escape, wished she could run away from the mess she had made. But there was no running, no hiding from the truth. It had come out, and now it was out of her hands. The silence in the house was deafening, and every corner of it seemed to echo with the weight of what had happened. She wanted to scream, to tear it all down, but the truth was simple and brutal. There was no going back. The sound of the front door opening made her freeze. Mark's footsteps echoed down the hallway again, but this time they were different, slower, hesitant. Lara didn't turn around. She couldn't. She couldn't face him like this. Her heart raced as the seconds stretched, but nothing came. No words. Nothing. Then, the silence came again. The finality of it hit her hard. She had broken something too fragile, too precious, and there was no glue strong enough to put it back together. She was left with nothing but the fragments of a relationship she had once believed in. Lara stood motionless by the window, the stillness of the house almost unbearable. She could feel the empty space where Mark used to be, where they used to be. The quiet stretched, like a wound that refused to heal. She could still hear the sound of his footsteps in her mind, echoing through the hallway, fading with each passing second. It wasn't just his absence that stung, it was the absence of something much deeper. Trust. Love. The foundation of everything they had was now cracked. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but she knew it wouldn't matter. He had asked for space. Time to think. Lara squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to hold it together. But the pain was too much. It had been building up, little by little, until it all spilled out. The weight of the truth. The guilt. The feeling that she had betrayed him, not once, but in so many little ways. She heard his voice in her head, that final question, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she didn't have an answer. She had never wanted to hurt him, never wanted to be the one to cause the fracture between them. But now there it was. And it felt like she couldn't even breathe. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, its hands moving forward with relentless precision. Laura felt like time itself was slipping away from her, dragging her further from everything she had known. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the stillness. She glanced at it, her heart sinking when she saw the message. It was from Mark. "I think I need more time. Please respect that." The words hit her like a slap, each one a reminder that everything was changing and she was powerless to stop it. She wanted to call him, to apologize again, to explain herself. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't change anything. Not now. The space between them had grown too wide. And what was worse, she didn't know if it could ever shrink again. She sank down to the couch, staring at the phone in her hands. The message was clear. Respect his need for time. But how could she sit here, waiting, when everything inside her was screaming for him to come back? Her thoughts spiraled, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. What would happen if she gave him the time he asked for? Would he come back? Or would that space just grow until there was nothing left to return to? Laura closed her eyes, her mind a blur of what-ifs. The truth had changed everything. But the question remained, was it too late to fix it? Laura sat there, the silence pressing in from all sides, each second stretching longer than the last. She clutched the phone in her hands, staring at Mark's message, the words swimming before her eyes. Respect his need for time. She had to. She knew that. But how could she respect it when her heart felt like it was shattering in her chest? The rawness of it, this emptiness, was overwhelming. Her mind kept drifting to the thought of him, sitting somewhere in their home, thinking, processing. What was he thinking now? What was he feeling? Laura closed her eyes, squeezing out the last of the tears that had been threatening to spill. She didn't want to cry anymore, not in front of him, not in front of the truth that had already cut too deep. The more she thought about it, the more the realization hit her. This wasn't just a mistake she could apologize for and make go away. No amount of tears, no words, would undo the damage. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. The space between them was growing, as if it had already turned into something bigger than just the physical distance between their bodies. It was something deeper, something she couldn't fix with a simple conversation. What had started as a small slip-up had now become the chasm that separated them. The truth. She had never imagined it would come to this. Her thoughts kept returning to that phone call, the one that started it all. How could she have been so careless? How could she have let something so small unravel everything they had? The memories of their life together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the plans they'd made, felt like distant echoes now. Like they were part of another life, one she wasn't sure she could ever get back. And yet, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the end. She had no idea how long Mark would need. How much space was enough? How much time before the silence between them turned into something unbridgeable? But there was one thing she was sure of. The longer she waited, the more fragile the hope of fixing this became. Every minute without him felt like a small piece of her slipping away. The thought of life without him, without the connection they once shared, made her stomach turn. Could they come back from this? She didn't know. And the not knowing was the hardest part. It felt like waiting in the dark for a light that might never come on again. The house was so quiet, so painfully still. Laura stood up slowly, her body stiff with exhaustion. Her thoughts were a maze, but one thing was clear. If there was any hope left, it would come only through patience. And patience was something she had never been good at. But she had no choice. Now. She had to wait. Wait for him to come to terms with everything. Wait for him to decide whether the space was enough to bring him back to her. And even then, even if he did return, could they really rebuild what had been broken? Could they truly heal after the truth had spilled out so violently? She didn't know. But all she could do now was wait. The waiting felt endless, stretching into hours, then days. Lara's thoughts were a constant storm, swirling with doubt and guilt, but one thing remained: the silence between them. She spent her days moving through the motions, cooking, cleaning, even picking up Mark's side of the bed, as if that might somehow make things right. But each task felt like a hollow repetition, a reminder of what had been lost. She avoided looking at her phone, the weight of Mark's last message hanging over her like a dark cloud. Respect his need for time. It had become a mantra she repeated to herself, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. She kept herself busy, but her mind always returned to him. Where was he? What was he doing? Was he thinking about her? The uncertainty gnawed at her. The longer the silence stretched, the more it began to feel like a canyon that was growing wider with each passing day. She had tried to reach out once, but when she saw his name on the screen, she couldn't bring herself to call. What could she say? The last time they spoke, the distance between them had been so palpable, so impossible to ignore. It felt like speaking would only make it worse, like she would be forcing herself into a space where she wasn't wanted. And so, she waited. And with the waiting came the doubt. Could Mark ever truly forgive her for what she'd done? She hadn't meant to hurt him. She hadn't meant to shatter everything they had built. But now, with each passing day, the possibility of things being the same again seemed to slip further away. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows through the windows, Lara found herself staring at the empty space where Mark's shoes used to be, where his jacket used to hang. She could almost feel his presence there, but it wasn't enough. Her chest tightened as she realized how much she missed him, how much she needed him. Needed to talk, to understand, to fix it all. But would he even want to? Would he come back? Or had the distance between them already grown too vast? Her heart ached at the thought. Then, just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, the sound of keys at the door made her freeze. She stood up, her heart skipping a beat. Could it be? Slow, tentative footsteps followed. She heard the soft creak of the door as it opened, and a moment later, Mark's voice came through, quiet but clear. "I'm home." The words sent a wave of hope crashing over her, but it was quickly followed by the sharpness of fear. Was he really back? Or was this just another moment in the limbo they had been trapped in for so long? Lara took a deep breath, steeling herself. And then, Mark appeared in the doorway, looking at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt like it had shrunk slightly, but it was still there, still too wide to ignore. He looked different. A little more weary, a little more guarded. Lara's heart ached, but she knew she had to face whatever came next. Mark broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hoarse. Lara nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. She waited, breathless, for what he was going to say. And then he spoke again, slower this time, as if testing the words before letting them out. I think I need to understand why you didn't tell me the truth. Why you kept it from me." The question hung in the air, heavier than ever. Lara swallowed, her mouth dry. She had been waiting for this moment, for him to ask. But now that it was here, she didn't know how to answer. Lara stood there, her breath caught in her chest. The question had come, just as she had feared. The reason she had been dreading the silence for days, weeks even. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She could feel the weight of his words, pressing down on her, suffocating her. Mark's eyes were fixed on her, waiting for an answer. But all Lara could do was stand frozen, her mind racing, scrambling for the right words. How could she explain the fear, the hesitation that had held her back? How could she explain the lie when she knew how deeply it had hurt him? I didn't want to lose you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I told you the truth, it would change everything. I thought it would make you look at me differently. Her words trembled as they left her lips, raw and painful, but they were the truth, however messy, however imperfect. Mark's gaze softened slightly, but the tension between them didn't ease. He shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why didn't you trust me enough to be honest with me from the start?" Lara's chest tightened as she struggled to find a way to explain something that was so hard to put into words. How could she explain the fear of losing him, the fear of seeing disappointment in his eyes, of knowing he might walk away? "I thought I could protect you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought if I kept it from you, if I hid it, you'd never have to feel what I was feeling. I didn't want to burden you with it." Mark took a step closer, his expression softening, but the silence between them still felt like a wall. "You shouldn't have carried that on your own," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't have thought that you had to protect me from the truth." "I could have handled it, Lara. I wanted to handle it with you." Lara closed her eyes, the pain of his words washing over her like a wave. She had known this. She had known he would say this. But hearing it, hearing him voice the hurt she had caused, made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. "I know," she whispered. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." There was a long pause. Mark didn't speak for a moment, and for a second, Lara thought he might walk away again, maybe even farther this time. But then, he exhaled sharply, his gaze softening. "I don't know if I can just forget this," he said quietly. "I don't know if things will ever be the same between us." Lara nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "I don't expect you to forget," she whispered. "But I'll do anything to make it right, Mark. I just need you to know that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." There was another silence, this one heavier, as if both of them were waiting for something, waiting for a sign, a signal that it wasn't all lost. Finally, Mark took another step toward her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for something, anything, that might still be there. Maybe we can try to figure this out," he said slowly, his voice uncertain but still holding a trace of hope. Lara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible? Could they really try to rebuild what had been shattered? But before she could answer, Mark reached out, his hand tentative but warm, offering a touch that felt like a fragile promise. Lara hesitated for a moment, her pulse racing, but then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was brief, but it spoke volumes. There was no easy answer, no quick fix to the damage that had been done. But in that moment, as their hands met, there was a flicker of something that resembled hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. Lara felt the warmth of his hand, the faintest touch that seemed to reverberate through her entire body. It wasn't a promise, not yet. But it felt like the first step, a step that had been long overdue. She squeezed his hand gently, her chest tight but her heart full of a kind of tentative hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days. Mark didn't pull away, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the oppressive, suffocating silence of distance and resentment, but something softer, fragile, but real. Lara wasn't sure if everything could be fixed with a touch, but she knew this was a start. A fragile beginning. Mark's eyes flickered, searching hers for something that he hadn't found in a long time. And for the first time since everything had started to unravel, Lara didn't feel the weight of her mistake bearing down on her. She still felt it, of course, the guilt, the shame, but there was something else now. A quiet understanding. A shared moment of vulnerability. "I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off," Mark said, his voice softer now. "But I'm willing to try. If you are." Lara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm here," she whispered. "I want to try too. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Mark seemed to search her face for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether her words were real, whether this was a moment they could both hold on to. "I know you'll try," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "But it's going to take time. I need time, Lara. I need to trust again." And I can't just forget how it felt when I found out. When I realized you weren't being honest with me. Laura swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. She had known this would take time. There was no magic fix, no quick solution to what they had been through. I understand, she said, her voice soft but sincere. I'll give you all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Mark gave a small nod, his expression pained but not entirely distant. I know, he said quietly. But it's not just about the apology. It's about building that trust back. It's about us working together, not hiding things from each other. Lara's heart tightened, but she didn't look away. I'm ready, she said. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Mark seemed to consider her words for a long time before finally nodding slowly. I think I'm ready too. To try. It wasn't a declaration of everything being fixed. It wasn't an immediate promise that everything would go back to normal. But it was something. A small spark in the darkness. Something to hold on to. Lara's fingers tightened around his, her chest still heavy, but lighter than it had been in days. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that with time, with patience, and with honesty, maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Slowly. One day at a time. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, heavy and uncertain, but not entirely devoid of light. Laura and Mark spoke more, but it was tentative, as if both of them were measuring the space between them with every word, every glance. They didn't rush. They couldn't. The air in their home was different now, more fragile, yet somehow still full of possibility. Each conversation felt like a test, a fragile attempt to rebuild something that had once felt so solid, so unshakable. Laura found herself watching Mark closely, reading his expressions, hoping to catch signs of that warmth they had once shared. But there was always a distance, a quiet hesitation in the way he moved, in the way he avoided certain topics. It was as though they were both still walking on thin ice, afraid to step too quickly, too soon. But there were moments. Moments when they sat together, no words needed, and the quiet between them wasn't filled with tension but with a kind of understanding. When he smiled at her, even if it was a small, uncertain smile, it felt like a little victory. But Laura knew it wasn't enough yet. It would take more than just smiles and quiet moments. It would take time, trust, and a lot of work. One evening, a week later, Mark sat down beside her on the couch, his body stiff but his presence still a comfort. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low, his eyes on the floor. About us. About everything. Laura turned toward him, her heart in her throat. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. Mark hesitated before looking up, meeting her gaze. I'm still not sure, Laura. I'm not sure how to move forward. I don't know how to trust you the way I used to. It's not just something I can turn on. Her heart sank. She had expected this, but hearing it still hurt. I understand, she whispered, her throat tight. I know it's not easy. I didn't expect it to be. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm willing to work through it. However long it takes. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. I appreciate that. I really do. There was another long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just honest. I think, Mark continued, his voice more uncertain this time, I need to see that things have changed. I need to know that you're truly being open with me now. That you'll always be honest, even when it's hard. Laura nodded, tears stinging her eyes but refusing to fall. I can do that, she said, her voice steady. I will. I promise. Mark looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, slowly, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay, he said. Then we'll take it one step at a time. Together. Lara's heart fluttered at his words. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was something. It was the first real promise they had made to each other since everything had fallen apart. and that in itself felt like progress. "I'm willing to try," she said, her voice stronger now. "I won't give up on us." Mark's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was something in his gaze that resembled trust, a flicker of hope. It wasn't all fixed. They both knew that. But in that moment, they were standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain, but real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them, while still present, began to feel less like a chasm and more like a bridge they were both willing to cross, step by step. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of the past pressed down on them, when silence filled the spaces where laughter and easy conversation had once been. But in those moments, Lara would reach for Mark's hand, and he would squeeze it, a silent promise that they weren't giving up. They had decided to take it slow, to let things unfold without rushing, without expecting too much too soon. The healing wasn't a straight line, but the cracks were slowly beginning to mend. One evening, after dinner, they sat together on the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows in the room. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that used to feel effortless between them. Mark turned to her, his expression serious but calm. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "I don't know if we'll ever go back to what we were. But maybe that's not such a bad thing." Lara looked at him, her heart tightening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, maybe we don't need to go back. Maybe we can build something new. A new version of us. One that's stronger. One that's built on trust." Lara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had always imagined that their relationship would be like a perfect circle, never-ending and unbroken. But maybe Mark was right. Maybe it wasn't about going back to what had been. Maybe it was about forging something new, something stronger, out of the wreckage of their past. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'd like to try. I don't want to go back either. I want us to move forward." Mark nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't afraid to face it together. And that, for now, was enough. They didn't need perfection. They just needed each other. And that, Lara realized, was all that truly mattered. The days continued to pass, each one bringing a quiet kind of progress, a slow, steady rebuilding. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the weight of their past mistakes hung over them like a dark cloud. But they had learned to weather it together, to acknowledge the pain, without letting it consume them. Lara found herself smiling more, genuinely smiling, in the little moments they shared. The way Mark would laugh at something silly, or the way they would sit together in silence, each of them finding comfort in the other's presence. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was enough. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the cool air of early spring brushing against their skin, Mark turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "I think I'm starting to understand," he said quietly, his voice filled with something Lara hadn't heard in a long time. Hope. Maybe it's not about getting back to what we were. Maybe it's about creating something new. Together. Lara looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She had thought so many times that they might never find their way back to each other, that the damage was too deep to repair. But here they were, still standing, still trying. "I think you're right," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster in her chest. "I don't need us to be who we were. I just need us to keep moving forward." Mark smiled then, a real smile, and Lara felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't a grand gesture, not some perfect resolution, but it was something they had earned together. They sat in the quiet for a moment, the stars above them twinkling softly in the clear night sky. For the first time in a long time, Lara didn't feel the ache of uncertainty. She felt peace. They had come through the storm, And though the road ahead was still uncertain, they were no longer afraid to walk it side by side. In that moment, Lara realized that sometimes the most beautiful thing isn't finding your way back to what you lost, but finding something new and unexpected in the space between. And that was enough. They would face whatever came next together.